Um, Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening. I'm not sure which part of the world you're joining us, but it's my great pleasure to welcome you today for the fifth session of the African Published Seminar Series. It's my great pleasure to have you today with us. Thank you for taking time to join our seminar. This part of the year, people are tired and you've probably been in so many Zoom meetings, but thank you for prioritizing us and joining our discussion today. This is an initiative between UMA and LASPOD. It's a collaboration between UMA at UCT and LASPOD is at Gastonberg in Senegal to curate this series. My name is Itai Makone. I'll be your host for today. And my colleague Ibrahim Nyang, who's also in the room, is a co-host to this African Published Seminar Series. He hosts the French series and I host the English series. And this is an open society funded initiative, and we're grateful for the funding. And the goal of the project really is to strengthen African publishing and dissemination. So the goal is the two major goals: to first identify the challenges and opportunities, and to find out, the second goal is to find out where interventions can be made to strengthen African scholarly publishing. My two other colleagues who are also in the room, Yusra Hamdawi and Job Maura, are curating a podcast in French and in English, with also the same goal to find out interventions, what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, where do the opportunities lie, and how can they be strengthened. Today we're privileged to have all of you in the room, and thank you for coming. More so, we're privileged to have our special guest today, Ms. Stephanie Kitchen. Welcome to the series. And before I hand over to her, I just want to share with everyone in the room her bio. Stephanie Kitchen has been the managing editor of the publications of the International African Institute, hosted at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, University of London, since 2008. The publications she manages include the African Studies Journal Africa, the major reference work African Biography, the Journal of African Cultural Studies, the International African Library Monograph Series, and the African Argument Book Series and associated blog sites. She is also a director of the African Book Collectors. So we're very privileged that she has rich information about Africa. So, well, thank you. I will hand over to Stephanie. She'll speak to us, she'll present for about 25 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. Thank you, Stephanie.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to speak in this seminar series. I titled my talk African Publishers Database and Co-Publishing, and I just put in the chat the link to the database I'm discussing among other topics. So the first section of my talk is titled The Politics of Databases and Metrics. And I thought I'd start by saying a few things about the politics of databases. What are they for? Whose interests do they serve? Are they useful? Now, this audience will be keenly aware of the politics of metrics and measurement, of journal impact factors and the like. We know that commercial databases such as Thomson Reuters that calculate journal impact factors tend to exclude African knowledge, listing few titles from the continent. They tell us how few such indexed journals the continent produces and what small percentages of global knowledge production the continent represents. Whilst not necessarily disputing such statistics, the modest aim of our project to compile a database of African book publishers from the continent is, in a sense, to demonstrate the opposite, the wealth and diversity of book publishing in the African continent, to counter notions of its invisibility and extreme, though remarkably commonplace assumptions along the lines that Africa has no publishers, echoing Hugh Trevor Roper's infamous and racist "Africa has no history" stereotype. For a continent that has produced and published writers like, and these are just a very few examples, Claude Eke, Pauline Hontonji, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Okot Kabitek, Thomas Mafolo, Achille Mbembe, Nadine Gordimer, Wole Soyinka, and contemporaries such as Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and the list just goes on. This is almost unbelievable. And yet, and particularly in so-called Lusophone and Francophone contexts, it is still usual to assume that the major centres of publishing are Paris, Lisbon, or London. Divine Fu's draft paper for this series, which I recommend to you, discusses with great eloquence the reasons for this state of affairs, and I won't repeat them here, other than perhaps to add that despite the knee on the neck of African publishing, and those were Divine's words, I thought they were wonderful, despite the structural adjustment regimes from which the continent's publishers and universities are yet to fully recover, despite the northern dominance of journal, textbook and literary publishing in the continent, there is good work going on that's quietly successful and sustaining. Led by some of the continent's leading publishers, Langa in Cameroon, Kudesria, African Minds, Makuki Nanyota publishers in Tanzania, Sub-Saharan publishers in Ghana, and now newer series of poetry and fiction presses in South Africa, including Ohulanga and Impepo Press, also Weaver Press in Zimbabwe, and many others. The African Books Collective is doing well. The number of new titles ABC has added to its list annually has increased from around 250 in 2018 to over 300 in 2020. Sales of books from the continent and income to the collective that is invested back to African publishers is going in a similarly positive direction. ABC has survived the pandemic thanks to its early investment in print-on-demand distribution, then ebooks and entire digital systems that plug into international book supply chains. Publishers themselves continue to produce innovative and exciting lists, which libraries throughout the world recognise as essential to their collections on Africa. Granted, the numbers of titles mentioned above, as derived from an entire continent's publishing infrastructure, are small. But as the scholar Morten Jerven has discussed in his analyses of economic data on and from the African continent, there is little value in directly comparing, for example, Sweden and Tanzania on any metric, be that school enrollments or economic growth. What matters is that Tanzania is making progress on its own terms. I see the work of this research group as tracking and monitoring progress in African publishing, despite the welter of adversarial structural factors that have been so eloquently analysed by authors such as Mamdani, Mkandawira, Hontonji, Bogoya, Fu, Zeleza, Amina Mama, and others, and they can make the points much better than I can, and other than to say I largely agree, I'll leave that there. The second section of my talk is on the African Publishers Database. So I put the link in the chat so you can see what I'm talking about. This African Publishers Database has been compiled by the IAI, where I work, based at SOAS in the University of London. And just to sort of very quickly summarise, the Institute itself exists to promote and publish knowledge produced in Africa and has been doing so since the 1920s through publishing journals and book series, as Atai mentioned, but also by drawing attention to interacting with and promoting African publishing, languages and knowledge infrastructures. So just to give you a few examples, a very early example was the Institute's English translation in 1931 of Thomas Mafolo's Chaka, which was originally published in 1928 by Lovedale Press in South Africa in the Sesotho language. The book went on to receive international acclaim and has been republished in countless new editions and is used for teaching throughout the world. The IAI has published since the 1980s the major print and online Africa bibliography that indexes annually thousands of articles and other publication types coming from the continent. Particular efforts are made to include journals from the continent. Another recent project we started on is the African Digital Research Repositories, which compiles all known research repositories coming from institutions in the continent. And whilst not perfect, for example, it isn't possible to search across all such repositories through our site, fundamentally the purpose is to consolidate fragmented knowledges, to align repositories from the continent with those in the global north, in a world where preprints are increasingly central to research knowledge, and to encourage other institutions with more resources and interests in open access to build and improve on our modest efforts. So what I'm also trying to say here is that knowledge activism, which so aptly captures what we're all engaged in, isn't new, but of course its reanimation by the decolonisation movement is highly welcome. So the IAI published its new database of African publishers early in 2021. The impetus for compiling it came particularly from university presses in North America, who were expressing interest in co-publishing monographs and other books in Africa, but were claiming lack of knowledge about possible outlets. I must admit that my first response to this complaint, channeled through the US African Studies Association about lack of information, was irritation. Why was it our job to furnish them with resources on African publishing? Couldn't they inform themselves of the continent's publishers? Links already existed, lots of information was on the internet, and so on. And I still stand by that view. But my calmer elders and wisers felt there was value in investing resources in such a project, and that there would be other gains. Equally, and here I was much more sympathetic, some publishers on the African continent were wishing to source work from US academic publishers for their domestic markets, and anything that would improve the visibility of publishers on the continent had to be a good thing. So with the IAI's financial support, we employed a research assistant to compile the database. The person we worked with, Anna de Mutis, working at SOAS for the IAI, is multilingual with strong French and Portuguese in addition to her English and native Italian. The database itself is aimed as a resource for researchers and those interested in the situation of publishing in Africa. It is a more comprehensive database than lists of publishers available through more targeted distributors or bibliographies, such as ABC, or Francois van Schalkwijk's excellent database of African university presses, or our own Africa bibliography, or African Journals Online, which indexes journal titles only. These are all valuable, but ABC lists the publishers it distributes only, which would exclude some publishers, for example, in South Africa. It's mainly Anglophone, with some exceptions, and it doesn't carry exclusively textbook or religious publishers. ABC distributes academic and scholarly fiction and general children's titles only. Francois van Schalkwijk's impressive, important and insightful research is focused on university presses. So we hope our modest project has something to offer to the wider brief of Divine Fu and colleagues' current continent-wide in-depth study into the state of scholarly publishing and dissemination on the continent. So users can sort the database and search by country, field, publisher name, language, type of publisher, scholarly, literary or academic, or subject discipline. And full contact details and further information are provided for the publisher where publicly available. So sort of drilling down into some of the data that's actually there, and which I've been doing for purposes of today and so on. The database lists just under 200 publishers from the continent, as well as some diasporic publishers from the following countries: Algeria, Benin, Botswana, Brazil, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Canada, DRC, Ethiopia, Egypt, France, Gabon, Gambia, Ghana, Guinea-Conakry, Guinea-Bissau, Kenya, Madagascar, Malawi, Mali, Mauritius, Morocco, Mozambique, Namibia, Niger, Nigeria, Portugal, Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Senegal, Somaliland, South Africa, Switzerland, Tanzania, Togo, Tunisia, Uganda, the UK, the USA, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. I must admit, checked what isn't there. I see Somalia isn't there, but as you can see, it's fairly broad. And languages, similarly, are broad. Languages of publication listed include Amharic, Arabic, English, French, Chawi, Tamazight. I don't know if I've pronounced that correctly. That's a language spoken in Egypt. Zambian languages, Ghanaian languages, Ewe, Ga, and Twi, Portuguese, German, Odi Cheredo in Namibia, South African languages Zulu, Xhosa, Afrikaans and others, Ndebele and Shona in Zimbabwe, Swahili, Creole and Malagasy in Mauritius, languages spoken in the DRC, in Mali and Senegal, such as Wolof and Pulaar, Somali, Spanish and Kinyarwanda. So it seems clear from our survey that everyday publishing of diverse materials, i.e. not simply the so-called top scholars extroverted towards international audiences following divine foods observation, in Africa is multilingual, using both African and European languages. And please note this is shorthand. I won't surmise the debates about whether formal colonial languages are or are not definitionally African. Sometimes the same publisher will have some books in Swahili and some in English, with a few specialising in publishing in multiple languages, presumably to curriculum requirements. And all this activity is going on despite the alleged extroversion and Anglicisation of African publishing, and I don't disagree with that critique. Some 65% of the publishers listed published books, as per the brief given to our researcher to prioritise book publishing, but also listed are, and here I quote a few examples, books and animated films, books for schools and the public at large aimed at achieving development goals, textbooks, general books, newspapers, magazines and gifts, books, academic publishing, magazines, business, media, web design services, books and art magazines, books, audiobooks, ebooks, books in braille, books, bulletins, journals, monographs, policy briefs, working papers, theses and dissertations, books, commentaries, journals, reports, statutes, that's for legal publishers, books and often a single journal or two, such as books, journal, cultural review of the Black world, books, journal, Humanité Gabonaise, Revue Internationale de Lettres, Sciences Humaines et Sociales, books, open access, books, reports, DVDs, books, research papers, policy briefs, briefings, journal, women in Islam, children's and educational books, folk tales, novels, short stories in any language, and that was a South African publisher, poetry, readings, resources for educators, books for young adults, school texts, books, charts, flashcards and workbooks. These are just some examples, but the picture is of a diversity of practice, including traditional and new media formats, tailored to particular requirements, languages and markets. I would suggest that from our survey, the picture of book publishing in the continent, therefore, is one of diversity, resilience and adaptation, and is certainly not a single story of African publishing. In terms of the types of books, many of the publishers we've indexed mention being scholarly or academic. Again, that was due to our selection bias, but other publishers describe themselves as doing activism or public engagement, being publishers of journalism, educational and training materials, literature, translations, research, dictionaries, and bi- and trilingual materials, publishing art or youth literature, publishing for a particular university or institution, publishing books written by different minority groups, writers, publishing minority group writers, publishing social commentary, publishing preschool books, children's books in Kiswahili, supplementary and information books, books for home-based learning and digital learning solutions, and publishing on religion and culture. A very wide range of subjects are published, ranging from art, culture, pop, photography and film, and the major humanities and social science disciplines. But we also found publishers with Afro-descendant themes, spirituality, publishers of anti-imperialism, resistance, justice and equality theme work, architecture and urban studies, biographies, memoirs, graphic novels, encyclopedias, biology, medicine and health, a vast array of children's books and literature, books on pedagogy and education, theatre and drama, disability studies, leisure, natural history and heritage, cookery, tourism, and significant legal publishing. And here I quote an example: hard science, mathematics, physics, chemistry, geology, biology, medicine, dictionaries, books on ancient Morocco, on migration, development in the informal sector, illustrated books on the art and the history of Morocco and the Mediterranean, agriculture and engineering, rock art and archaeology, science, Arabic culture, diaspora and decolonial studies, on peace, refugee rights, women's rights, and violence against women, on particular ethnicities or histories, such as, and here's an example, Ohobo Studies, People, History and Culture, that's a Nigerian publisher. In terms of the sort of rough length of operation of the publishers in our database, we found publishers established in the 19th century, Juta in South Africa established in 1883, and Wits Press in South Africa established in 1922. University Press in Nigeria was established in 1949. Présence Africaine was founded in Paris in 1949. Edition Ambozontani in Madagascar was established in 1952, but the majority of publishers have been established in the independence period post-1960 up until within the last 10 years. For some publishers, we've added relevant contextual information, such as significant individuals involved in setting up the publishing house, links with universities and other institutions, moves, mergers, and so on. Our database lists publishers' websites and social media platforms and information about distribution networks. Many are distributed through ABC, but there's also Blue River, Afrilivre, Africulture, Diffusion Nord and Sud, Polon, Diffusion, and also via subsidiary arrangement. So we're obviously aware the database is not comprehensive. Selected publishers in languages other than English, such as French, Portuguese, Arabic, Swahili, and other African languages were added. And we made great efforts to include a wider array of Francophone and Lusophone publishers than is usual. But we know we haven't got adequate Arabic coverage, and that was largely an issue of resources and skills. It's likely too that not all publishers listed are fully active. The IAI will maintain the database as an ongoing resource, and it's obviously open access there on the internet. So do send us information on omissions and oversights, and we'll be happy to add them. The third part of my talk is on co-publishing and accessibility, I called it. So I think first and very importantly to emphasize that we, the IAI, I'm sure as a research community, we support and encourage authors to publish with publishers on the African continent. And this really should not need saying. It was common practice in the 1960s and 1970s for scholars such as Claude Ake, Okot Papitek, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Samir Amin, Pauline Hontonji, Amina Mama, Mahmoud Mamdani, Tandika Makandawira, Dan Nabuderi, Isa Shivji, Yashit Handan, and Paul Zalaser, alongside several of the early liberation leaders, including Samora Machel, Agostina Neto, and Nathan Samuyarira, to choose to publish in Africa. And academics writing on Africa from elsewhere would often follow in their stead. The IAI has recently published some guidelines for authors on publishing and co-publishing in African studies. And recommendation number 1 is to, quotes, consider publishing your book with an African publisher. Consult options via, e.g., African Books Collective, International African Institute. The second guideline is, if you initially publish with a northern publisher, such as a university press, discuss with your publisher in the first instance if they are able and willing to arrange a co-publication or edition with an African publisher. Some publishers may be willing and placed to negotiate such co-editions on your behalf, with advice from you as knowledgeable about the publishing sector in the country concerned. But if not, it may be wise to reserve certain rights and arrange co-publication yourself. And we can obviously talk about the practicalities in the Q&A if anyone's interested. So a practical purpose of our database is to actively encourage individual authors and scholars, as well as publishers based in the global north with relevant books to the continent, to seek co-publishing opportunities in Africa. Some may say there are limited markets for such books, which is often true in cases of specialist work, or that the digital has superseded conventional rights territories, i.e. originating publishers expect global e-rights. But our experiences show that co-publishing of print books, and the model can be transferred to digital, is the more equitable and efficient route to specific readerships. Most importantly, as books can be costed and published locally, and affordable pricing is possible. I'm now going to mention a few examples of books whose co-publication I've been involved in, just to give a sense of the range and possibilities. So Liz Gunner, who's at the University of Johannesburg, her book Radio Soundings, South Africa and the Black Modern was published by the IAI and Cambridge University Press, then by Wits University Press in South Africa. Danelle van Ziel Herman's Privileged Precariat, White Workers in South Africa's Long Transition to Majority Rule was similarly recently published by the IAI and CUP and is being published by Jacana in 2022. We published a book by a German scholar, Benedict Pontzen, Islam in Azongo, Muslim Life Worlds in Asante, Ghana, for which we are arranging co-publishing with sub-Saharan publishers in Accra, Ghana. Hannah Höchner's academic book on Quranic schooling in northern Nigeria was co-published with Premium Times in Nigeria. In that case, gratis copies were provided by the IAI to Premium Times, shipping costs were covered, and the author used her own research funds to assist in promotion. Turning to our African Arguments series, the book Taxing Africa, it's called Taxing Africa, Coercion, Reform and Development, which is on context and changes required for more equitable national and international tax regimes, was a policy relevant work based on decades of research collaboration across continents. And this IAI book with Z Books was co-published by HSRC Press in South Africa, and we then gave HSRC Press a couple of years to sell their print run before making the book fully open access, which we've done recently with support from the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. Generally, to make such co-publication arrangements work, sometimes modest subsidies are provided, and these are of the order of around £1,000 or $1,500, sometimes even less, to facilitate marketing or lower pricing of these editions in Africa. And they're not always necessary, but in cases of sort of academic books where, you know, the costs are always sort of tight, it often works to find a subsidy from a research grant or an institution that's got this sort of money available. It can make a real difference. What else is required? I'd say compromise and understanding in arranging such rights deals, such as waivers of license fees, providing digital text and cover files, ideally for free, as well as making available readers' reports and the like. The challenges, of course, are well known. Depressed markets for printed books in Africa, and now more so in the pandemic, probably with school and university shutdowns. Northern publishers unwilling to license titles for which they have global rights, which is a huge issue, and their indifference and lack of engagement in markets seen as marginal. And I thought I'd end on the positive, on my hopes. It's my hope that such major research programs as yours are strengthening African scholarly publishing run by HUMA and LASPAD, the new Global Africa Journal, the ASAA conference series, interventions such as the IAI's recent African Publishers Database, and long-standing projects such as the services offered by the African Books Collective and many other initiatives reanimated by global movements to decolonize knowledge production, to address ethics of research collaboration, and to achieve much better access to the fruits of intellectual labor, but also the possibilities to publish such work in the continent, will help raise the profile of Africa's publishers and drive resources. And by resources, I mean sort of very broadly, authors, manuscripts from domestic and international spaces. So origination and co-publishing, reviewers, research and development funding, support from universities and trained staff. So in other words, not just money, but a much broader understanding of resources to support the programs African publishers are to some considerable extent already providing. And I'll finish there, and I'm happy to discuss my points and take questions and hear your experiences and reactions.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. The interesting thing is I've actually had an opportunity, I think for the past 2 months, to go through the database and use it. And I will actually say it has been personally useful for us at UMA, because I've been able to get in touch with publishers in in Malawi, and they've been very responsive and they've been able to talk back to us. And without this resource, I wouldn't have been able to speak to some people. So thank you very much for putting this together. In case you didn't know, it is a very useful resource. Thank
It's really nice to hear. It's nice because, you know, we sort of just do these things and put them out there as scholarly commons, but it's nice to know that you found it useful.
Yeah. And also, I think it's an ambitious project, because we're also trying to, like my colleagues, we're also trying to put a database for journals. And like in compiling all the categories, it's been a mammoth task to find information for some countries. And I resonate with what you're saying. Like some countries, I could, on your database as well, I couldn't find Lesotho, Swaziland, Sao Tome, Cape Verde, Equatorial Guinea. I was hoping I'd find them, but even online, it's a struggle to find information for some countries. To everybody who's in the room, I would like you can raise your hand or put an emoji, or so that we can raise your hand if you have a question and we can unmute, or if you can't speak, you can put it, please raise your hand and then we'll be able to unmute you and you can speak. For any questions, I'll also check if there are any questions on Facebook. While you are thinking of your questions, I have the monopoly of power today. So I can ask another question. I can ask a question if people don't. Okay. So please raise your hands or use a reaction to raise your hands to add questions or comments. While you're thinking of your reactions. Oh, okay. Divine has a question. So I will allow you to go first because I always have the monopoly to speak.
Thank you, Itai. And thank you, Stephanie, for such a rich presentation, and also for this database. As you know, I am obsessed with publishing and so scholarly publishing. So it is one of those fields which seems to get little attention because people use it mainly as an accessory, you know, just to disseminate their work. So it also explains why there's not, much investment in thinking through it theoretically or conceptually. So thank you very much, for the presentation. The first is maybe just reflecting on how one applies the notion of Africa and African to this, because that's a big challenge, especially when one is dealing with something which is in itself a cultural product, because publishing itself comes from a particular history. Academic and scholarly publishing also comes from a particular place. So when one engages with this notion of what constitutes African publishing, it raises all sorts of issues. Like you've spoken, for example, about Présence Africaine, about places like Cartala. We have all of these places that have or big multinationals that have built other headquarters, or how do you say, subsidiaries on the continent, but which now are critically engaged with what we're beginning to call decolonial work or decolonization work. And I recall last week or several weeks back when we had the workshop on publishing, the question of ownership, emerged, that what we seem to not invest too much in trying to interrogate, ownership and how that defines publishing. So the question is, what is African, in this context? What did you find African in what you were doing, in this database? Because there is so many. It's great to find so many publishers doing scholarly work and doing other work on the continent. But the old question about University of Makerere being the University of Oxford in Makerere, or the University of Ibadan being the University of Cambridge in Ibadan, we're back to that question. So I thought you should reflect on that. And the other would be around the issue of gender, which is key, and gender and also labor in several ways. One is just in terms of those who control who make intellectual decisions on the power of publishing. Those also have the owners of labor, and then, but on the other hand, you find that a lot of the labor, and this is on a level that is unaccounted for, is actually performed by women. So I just wanted you to reflect on that. Thank you.
I don't think I can deal with all of it. I mean, gender clearly deserves its own project, and I think it's a really fertile area. You're talking about using inspiration from feminist work and relating that to what's happening in publishing, and that seems to me to be a very fertile. I've seen some stuff sort of pointing out that the number of female publishers in the continent has really increased significantly, which may also be related to technology, and that you don't need as much capital to start with. I mean, that's just a guess. I mean, someone I'm sure is researching that somewhere. I agree that there's nothing particularly gender specific, and actually not that much jumped out at me in terms of lists and topics. I mean, I sort of went through a slightly tedious sort of summary of all the different kinds of publishing that's going on, but that was really to make the point that it is really quite wide and diverse and every day. But actually gender didn't particularly jump out at me as being top of publishers lists. So I mean, maybe a trick really is being missed. Obviously there's the Africa Gender Institute at Cape Town, there's Cadesria, but these are old centres, and it wasn't the sort of top topic. And that said, there's lots being published by women. So but I think that probably you should have a session in this seminar on publishing and gender if you haven't done one. I mean, on the selections and the question of ownership and multinationals, I mean the multinationals are not in this database because the original conception was around co-publishing opportunities, but with a sort of broader, more disseminated, research use, such as Itai has applied it. And we don't have any commercial imperative or vested interest in that sense. I mean, beyond the kind of odd case of our own books, but I mean, that really is very incidental. So, the so-called, what I just sort of called as diaspora publishers, the researcher just put them in, like Présence Africaine, and she didn't put in Cathalo actually, but she put in Présence Africaine, and she put in the Research Institute in Switzerland, and she mentioned the fact that the University of Namibia Press is published historically in German, and I just left it because I thought, well, it might be of interest. It is part of the history, I mean, and there's no doubt about that. So I didn't worry too much about a sort of very purist sort of ABC style definition, which would, the publisher has to be owned and capitalized in the African continent, which was always where ABC was coming from, although they've relaxed a little bit, I think, around that in recent times. But I do think, I mean, the question of ownership is clearly crucial. And Itai, you mentioned trying to compile lists of journals and how much more of a nightmare that is than books. I mean, the book publishing world, I think in some ways is quite friendly and quite sort of, the journal thing, there's age-old, but there's a different list, sort of editors list. Like, I'd have to find the link for you. And then there are all these multinational journals that are African in theme and material, but they're obviously owned from elsewhere. So I don't think we can resolve that. I think, there's those definitions. We included a lot of North African publishers, but someone posted the list on social media, and the immediate response was, you've only got X number from Tunisia, X number from Morocco, and X number from Egypt, which I'm sure is fair. I'm sure that critique is fair, but we absolutely included North Africa, and what we haven't got is all the Arabic publishing, in the sense that we just couldn't access. the information online. And, you know, had we had an Arabic researcher, we could have done that. That's more money, that's more time. Maybe we can do that in the next round. I think there was a sort of balance between it has to be practically useful. This was coming from North America. I was obviously keen that it had a kind of basic research use as well. So yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephanie. So I will, there's a question in the chat. So I'll read the question in the chat. I'll add mine to that question, and then I'll ask one person to also speak, and then you can respond to the two questions at the same time. So there's a question again from Divine. I think it's a follow-up. He says, how do you deal with power dynamics in co-publishing, especially in the world of metrics and counting? Metrics equals ownership, citation equals indexes. And that's his question. My question, when you're speaking, I was just thinking, how do you make the relationship between co-publishing between the North and the South more equal? Like just exactly like what Divine's saying. How do you make the power balance? Because I think in the literature, it's more tipped to favor the Northern, but you said you created guidelines, and you came up with guidelines to advise authors on how they can make co-publishing work. So in practice, how can you actually make it work? I think it goes along with what Divine is saying. And then the second question will come from Job. Job, you are actually unmuted. Can you please say your question, and then Stephanie will take that round of questions. Yes, Job.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm also one of the postdocs in this project, in charge of East Africa and Anglo-West Africa. First of all, is to thank you for your wonderful presentation, and especially for painting, a positive picture about scholarly publishing in Africa. Even in the midst of all the challenges that we face, there's some important works that is going on by publishers, by scholars, and so on. And you have done well to remind us of that. Sometimes we do forget. I mean, we tend to forget those positive things. But in the database that you put together, which I've also found very important for this project. My question will relate to what Divine asked on the issue of gender, and whether you paid any attention to maybe gender dynamics, for instance, by asking or reflecting on who is managing these imprints or publishing houses. Thank you.
Hi. So other than simply naming contacts on the database, the honest answer is we didn't have a particular gender dimension in thinking this through. I mean, it's an open resource. We could certainly, go away and do that. That sounds like a very good idea, and it's interesting that there's so much interest in that. So you'd have to sort of mine it in quite an annoying way to find, sort of evidence of female publishing. That obviously there are women there owning publishers and so on, and I could sort of do an eye check and tell you, who in East Africa I think is but I think also publishing on gender. I mean, women as publishers, women as editors, women as decision makers, but also the topic of gender, right? And not just women, but gender studies very broadly conceived. I mean, my sense is there's not that much of it actually, from that as distinct from women running publishing houses. So thanks for that, and I think we could certainly look at that. I mean, on co-publishing and power, okay, so my sense is equal relations should be possible. There's no question. If we co-publish with a publisher in Germany or with the US, there are mutual benefits in terms of, efficient access to domestic markets. So I see no problem with the practice of co-publishing, and authors want it. It makes a lot of sense. It might actually, with this sort of issue of transactions and COVID and moving books around the world, printing locally is all on vogue again, and printing where the books are intended, you know, and so in that sense, it makes lots of sense. Obviously, in the kind of African studies world where there's so much inequality and there's so much distorted power towards the north, it's very difficult. And I think that is why our number one recommendation is it is much easier for the African publisher if the originating book goes to the African publisher, who can then co-publish if they want to with North America. The reality of the world that at least I'm operating in is where you know scholars are really still quite hostile, and you know I think that's partly why I was trying to present a positive picture, partly because I think it's there, it's true, you know, all the stuff I said about ABC improving and progressing is actually what's going on in my observation, but it's somehow really important to try to get across to academics that, you know, what I'm seeing in Europe actually is decolonization talk, but then in practice, European scholars obsessed with publishing in North America. I mean, you know, Chicago, Duke, California, you know, and they see that as somehow more prestigious than even publishing with us. So sort of everything's going in the wrong direction, and then the ASA in the US sort of wants to talk to us about how you sort of, you know, encourage co-publishing. Well, it is all upside down. I mean, ideally, in the world of the 60s and 70s, top scholars published in the continent supported those publishers, and those books would find their way around the world. That isn't the world that we're in at the moment. I feel as challenged by that as everyone here.
Hello. Okay.
Sorry, I finished. Itai, you.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going on. There's praise for you in the chat from Shari. She says, thank you for this really interesting session. As co-editor of an African Studies journal based in the UK, and as a researcher involved in book publishing conversations with an international research team, this is very aware of the power dynamics of co-authorship and publishing. This was very useful. I appreciate the resource and the thought here. That's for you. For those who have questions, you can raise your hand and ask your question. I have a different question from something. Okay, I'll give myself a chance before Divine. Divine has another question. So I'll say my question, then Divine can say his question. Actually, I have a different question. I was reading, you have extensive experience, right, in dealing with African Studies Journal, African Biography, the Journal of African Cultural Studies. Like, you've done so much work on African material, African work. What are your thoughts on quality? Or what is quality? How do you define quality? Like, so I'm an academic, and orientation is I would first want to publish in the UK or wherever. And then if I get rejected, I'll then publish locally. And then, like, my first protocol is to go north. If I don't get something north, I will publish in the south. But then, what's the difference? Is there a difference in quality with the manuscripts submitted from Africa, from Europe? What are your thoughts on quality? How do you define quality? Do you see much difference, or where the areas that need to be improved? What's the real definition of quality from your perspective over the years of experience? That's my question. And I will allow Divine to unmute himself and speak.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. It wasn't asking me, giving me the opportunity to unmute myself. So, Stephanie, I mean, it's just a follow-up. I mean, I see that Mano is in the room. So you have this book, you know, that's African Sustainable Development Goals. This is supposed to be a co-publication between the World University Network and Springer.
Mm-hmm.
If I go onto the shelf, this is what I get.
Mm-hmm.
You see?
African Sustainable Development Goals.
And what do you see? You see in the middle, you see that's Springer. You don't see the World University Network, you see? And And then what's interesting is that, so when we do research on the statistics, the metrics around African scholarly publishing. So if you go now to Google Scholar, I mean, one of the spaces where this is indexed, you see you get that. So the two books. So this is another book with Z and Codestia. Do you see who is indexed there? It's Z that's indexed. It is Springer that's indexed. So it's a co-publication. And it's great. We have made this aesthetics and all of these politics. We've co-published, but see who is indexed. So when it comes to counting and counting the contribution that either the continent or either Codosphere or either WN or others have made, you see who is counted. So even though you've published, you've still perished, because the way citations work and the way indexing and matrices work is that it works in this kind of politics and aesthetics in such a way that you can actually write yourself out. You write yourself out in many ways. That on the spine of the book, when it is on the shelf, and I want to pick it out, I actually cannot see that Codesia or WN has published. All I see is Springer. And that when I go into Google, I actually can pick it. And these are this is the kind of politics. That's why I'm pushing, asking, what is it when one says one is co-publishing? What is it when one says one is collaborating? What are the elements that, apart from just asking that, you need to have manuscripts come from here, you need to have authors collaborate with people. The aesthetics themselves of distribution and of dissemination ensure that even when the manuscript comes from the African continent, people can still publish and still perish.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and it links really nicely with the ties point and about what is quality. I mean, is quality simply prestige? I mean, or status? Is that what we're, the kind of atmosphere we're creating? I mean, my sort of quality. I mean, frankly, I mean, I see very high quality coming from South African research. Lots does come to us because, as you say, people look to publish outside. Our journal Africa receives 200 submissions a year, a lot from the African continent, and some of them are really, really good, especially in terms of, sort of dense ethnographic type data that is from the ground so I think, perceptions of quality are a sort of very thorny issue. I mean, the kind of the basic tool, I suppose, we all use and claim and defer to, which is also political, is peer review. But I mean, sort of monitoring quality through robust systems of peer review, sort of have basic faith in, but it's highly subjective. But we really have to get away from this notion that the North is quality and the North has a monopoly on quality. No one has a monopoly on quality. And, I see very high standards of scholarship in South Africa and from scholars, but also from publishers. Springer doesn't have a monopoly on quality. I mean, and there were some very bad books published by some of the commercial publishers in areas we know about. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephanie. Okay, if you have a question, you can raise your hand. Unfortunately, today I have the monopoly of power. We are left with a minute to end. I will just extend it by 2 minutes by asking my question. If there's anybody else. If there's a question by anybody else, please raise your hand. Stephanie, from the database, this is the question from the database. You didn't go forth to find which ones are active, but which disciplines, like what I like from the database is that it's more reflective of like the humanities, the arts and social sciences. You find literally arts publishers there, and that was something that I really liked and picked up, because most of the indications are just that the sciences are more sustainable than the humanities of material being published. And I really like that. It's just a comment. Thank you for that. Minga, can you unmute yourself and ask a question? I think at this point, if there's nobody else who's going to speak after Minga, Stephanie can answer Minga and also say her closing remarks.
Yes, thank you so much, Stephanie, for such a presentation, and thank you, Itai, for facilitating this this session. I've put in a chat, and I'm so happy that Divine has picked up something that many of us could not really pick it up. It's just a comment. I don't know if it's a comment or a question. Isn't a question of visibility also? Because I heard you saying that, if you want to publish, you rather publish into an African, consider to publish in an African, with an African publisher. But the thing is, the infrastructure also in African publishers is becoming a bit problematic. In a sense of, especially the book that Divine picked up, it's all Springer. If you go online, you're going to find Springer, but you're not going to find the WON in it. I would like you to reflect a bit on that politics of visibilities, because people publish because they want to be visible. So I'm just using this example that Divine has provided here. Can you please elaborate a little bit on that? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we can load onto the individual researcher, whether they're in Africa or in Europe, the entire responsibility of kind of turning the system upside down, if you like, and certainly at an individual level, in terms of advising you where to publish, I tend to sort of have quite a sort of broad view. I suppose my politics, I broadly agree with the politics of ABC. I agree with the politics of, the long solution to this is top scholars publishing in the continent and controlling ownership of those books and deciding themselves where or whether they want to license them, not being frustrated by, Springer's lack of visibility of the African partner. And that said, as a sort of an individual level where you're trying to get your research published, where it's important to be visible, of course, scholars from the continent, from all over the world, submit to all kinds of so-called international journals, and I don't see, there's certainly no individual issue with you doing that, but I don't think simply holding everything back and not publishing where you see your work best placed is the answer to any of this either. I think what's really good is when senior scholars commit to publishing in the continent, because they can afford to do that. They can, they've got their jobs, they've got their reputations, and they can afford to do that, and their books will be visible. I don't think we can sort of load that whole burden on the new generation of postdocs and so on. But obviously, the more academics are aware of these issues, the better. And from where I sit, I'm astounded sometimes of a real ignorance of any of this, or where someone, I've done 10 years research in Malawi, and you say, well, you know all about the publishers there and know nothing, and this and that. So I think it's difficult. And what I'm saying publicly today, I would certainly say individually to you in context, but I also wouldn't sort of say, don't send your paper to, that journal there if that's what you need to do, because that's not how we change this. We change it through commitment, we change it through investment, through resources and so on, but not by sort of moralizing individuals about decisions about their publishing choices, which are very, very difficult. And we should acknowledge they're much more difficult where you're dealing with these, sort of impoverished infrastructures through no fault of the publishers, and it's also to do with university funding and reward systems and this sort of bigger ecosystem. So I'm sympathetic to that question, and I'm very sympathetic on the sort of arts and science thing. I think again, our sort of interest, our selection bias was probably towards humanities and social science, arts rather than science, but it's also the case that you get a lot more book publishing in those disciplines than you do in science, which is more journals. So Yeah, it's interesting that your perception is there's a lot more science publishing. I suppose I exist in the humanities and social science, so but you're right, of course. Minga, did I sort of meet your point?
Yes, yes.
Sort of, yeah.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for your time. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your presentation. It was very wonderful. And we interacting with you, I mean, we got a really good grounding on the thinking behind the database and ways we can improve publishing.
Thanks for your comments on it as well. I mean, you know, we hadn't given great thought to many of the points you raised, so I can take that away.
Thank you so much. And thank you for everybody in the room. Thank you for coming. Please join us tomorrow. We still have the African Advanced Epistemology Seminar, and you can also make time for Thursday. We have an entire series. You can check these events on the UMA webpage. And our next African Publishing Seminar series is on the 27th of July. Keep an eye out for that on Twitter, on our page, and on our Facebook page. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much, Stephanie, and all the participants. Please have a wonderful evening.
You too. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.